Just 5 weeks after my mother's funeral, my father moved his mistress into our home and threw me out onto the street with nothing but a trash bag of clothes. I was only 18. 9 years later, I was sitting alone in my office when an automated legal notification flashed across my screen. They were selling my late mother's farm for millions. The very same farm my father swore he had lost to foreclosure years ago. When I showed up to confront them, he dropped a check at my feet and threatened to destroy me if I did not sign away my rights. He had no idea what I did for a living, and he had no idea what I was preparing to bring to the courthouse on Wednesday morning. Before I share exactly how I legally dismantled their entire lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against a family that tried to erase you. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old now, and I work as a senior title examiner. But when this nightmare reached its breaking point, I was 27, a junior examiner sitting in a cramped, windowless office at a mid-sized title agency in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. It was a humid Tuesday night. The office was completely empty except for me. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the glow of my dual computer monitors were my only company. I had spent the last 9 years surviving entirely on my own. I worked my way through college, paid for my own certifications, and clawed my way into the real estate title industry because I needed to understand the mechanics of ownership, of permanence, of things that could not simply be taken away. I built a quiet, solitary life far removed from the toxic shadow of my father and the woman who replaced my mother. I was just wrapping up a complex commercial title search when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an automated property alert from the county clerk database. I had set up tracking alerts for various familial properties years ago, a habit born from paranoia and a lingering distrust of my father's financial dealings. I picked up the phone, rubbing my tired eyes, and read the subject line of the forwarded email from a luxury development firm. Final notice of purchase. The Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over until they blurred. The Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm was my late mother's property. It was 50 acres of prime, beautiful land located just outside the city limits. It had been in her family for generations. After she passed away from breast cancer when I was 18, my father, Desmond, looked me right in the eye and told me the farm was gone. He claimed my mother had secretly taken out massive loans against the land to pay for her medical treatments, and that the bank had immediately foreclosed on it to settle the debts. I was young, grieving, and entirely ignorant of how real estate law actually worked. I believed him. And shortly after he told me that lie, he moved Valerie, his longtime mistress, into our family home. When I dared to express my disgust and heartbreak, Desmond slapped me across the face, pointed at the door, and screamed that if I could not handle his new life, I needed to get out. I left that night with nothing. Now sitting in the blue light of my office monitors, the truth hit me with the force of a freight train. There was no foreclosure. Desmond had lied to my face to steal my mother's legacy. My fingers flew across my keyboard as I logged into the agency's private database. I ran a preliminary search on the property address and found the pending transaction. A commercial development group was in the final stages of acquiring the 50 acres for $4.5 million. The closing date was scheduled for that very week. I did not waste time crying. I did not sit there mourning the past. I grabbed my car keys, left my coffee half full on the desk, and marched out to the parking garage. The drive from downtown Atlanta to the affluent suburbs of Buckhead took 40 minutes, but my mind was racing so fast, I barely registered the traffic. I pulled my modest sedan up to the towering iron gates of my childhood home. The sprawling brick mansion sat far back from the street, surrounded by manicured hedges and expensive landscaping. The house I had been banished from 9 years ago looked even more opulent, now funded no doubt by my father's ruthless business maneuvers. I marched up the long, sweeping driveway, my heart pounding a steady rhythm of absolute rage against my ribs. I did not bother to ring the doorbell politely. I hammered my fist against the heavy mahogany wood. A few moments later, the door swung open. Standing there was Valerie. She was draped in expensive silk loungewear, holding a crystal wine glass. But what immediately drew my eye, what made the blood roar in my ears, was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. She was wearing my late mother's vintage pearls, the pearls I had begged my father to let me keep before he threw me out. Valerie's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in surprise before settling into a familiar, cruel sneer. Still lurking around Kendra, she drawled, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your father kicked you to the curb at 18 for a reason. Go back to whatever cheap apartment you rent. We are expecting important guests tonight, and we do not have time for your charity cases." I did not retreat. I stepped forward, forcing her to step back or be run over. "I am not here for charity, Valerie. I am here about my mother's farm." Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to know I had caught them in the act. I pushed past her, ignoring her shrill protests as she demanded I leave her house. The sound of clinking glasses and laughter drifted from the grand living room at the back of the house. I followed the noise, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. I rounded the corner and stepped down into the sunken living room. The scene before me looked like an advertisement for unearned luxury. Desmond stood by the marble fireplace, looking older, but just as arrogant, wearing a tailored suit and popping a fresh bottle of expensive champagne. Sitting on the plush velvet sofas were Valerie's daughter Jada and Jada's fiancé, Connor. Connor was a wealthy, entitled white man who carried the unmistakable air of generational privilege. His family owned one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in the state. Spread out across the massive glass coffee table between them were wide, glossy blueprints. I did not need to step closer to know what they were. They were architectural plans to bulldoze my mother's legacy. They were mapping out an exclusive luxury golf community directly over the soil where my mother had grown up, where my ancestors had lived and worked for over a century. Desmond looked up, the champagne bottle freezing in his hands. The jovial celebration died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. "What are you doing in my house?" he demanded, his voice dropping into that dangerous, commanding tone he used to terrify me with as a teenager. I walked right up to the coffee table, looking down at the glossy development plans. "The Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm." I read aloud, tracing the property lines on the paper. "You told me the bank took it, Dad. You looked your grieving 18-year-old daughter in the eye and swore the land was gone." Jada let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes and leaning into Connor's shoulder. "Oh my God, can we not do the tragic orphan routine tonight? We are trying to celebrate a massive corporate acquisition. Do not let her ruin the vibe, Connor." Connor chuckled, swirling his drink. He looked at me as if I were a speck of dirt on his expensive loafers. "Look, Kendra, is it? Your father is the legal executor of the estate. My family's firm just acquired the property for $4.5 million. It is business. The paperwork is going through, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. We break ground on Wednesday." Desmond set the champagne bottle down with a sharp thud. He pulled a leather checkbook from his breast pocket, uncapped a gold pen, and quickly scribbled across the paper. He ripped the check from the binding and dropped it deliberately onto the floor right at my feet. It was a check for $5,000. "Take the money," Kendra, Desmond said, his voice cold and flat. "Take this and sign the quitclaim deed so Connor's firm can proceed without any annoying title delays. If you do not sign it, I will have my lawyers tie you up in litigation for the rest of your natural life. I will bury you in legal fees until you are homeless. You have no money, you have no power, and you have no claim. Do not be stupid. Take the scraps I am offering you and get out of my sight." Valerie stood in the doorway behind me, a smug smile stretching across her face as her fingers idly stroked my mother's pearls. She clearly expected me to break down. They all expected the frightened, desperate teenager they had thrown out 9 years ago to surface and accept her defeat. Instead, I looked at the check lying on the rug. I slowly bent down and picked it up. Desmond smirked, thinking he had won. I held the check between my fingers, looked directly into my father's eyes, and deliberately ripped the paper straight down the middle. I stacked the pieces, ripped them again, and let the shredded paper fall like snow over Valerie's pristine designer rug. Connor stood up, his face flushing red with anger at my absolute disrespect for their authority. "What the hell is your problem?" he barked. I ignored him. I kept my eyes locked on the man who was supposed to protect me, the man who had sold out his own family for a payout. "I do not want your dirty money, Desmond, and you do not own that land." I turned on my heel and began walking out of the living room, leaving them standing in stunned silence. As I reached the doorway, I paused and looked back over my shoulder. "I will see you on Wednesday, Dad." The very next evening, I drove to the prestigious Oakmont Country Club, a sprawling, exclusive property nestled deep in the wealthiest district of the city. This was the venue for Jada and Connor's lavish engagement party. The parking lot was a sea of luxury European sports cars and sleek black SUVs. A massive crystal chandelier was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, casting a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns. I did not arrive in the ragged clothes they remembered me wearing. I arrived in a sharply tailored emerald green suit that I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. I walked with the absolute authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. I bypassed the valet, strode directly up the wide stone steps, and glided past the security desk with such unwavering confidence that the guards simply nodded and opened the heavy brass doors for me. The ballroom was packed with Connor's elite, predominantly white family, along with a sea of wealthy real estate investors, corporate executives, and high society socialites holding flutes of vintage champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the clatter of wealth. I spotted them immediately. Jada, Connor, Valerie, and Desmond were holding court at a massive VIP table near the center of the room, surrounded by Connor's powerful parents and a dozen sycophantic guests. They were laughing, toasting to their future, entirely secure in their bubble of privilege and stolen money. I did not hesitate. I walked straight across the polished hardwood dance floor, making a direct line for their table. Jada noticed me first. Her champagne flute froze halfway to her lips. Her eyes widened in absolute shock before narrowing into slits of pure venom. She immediately stepped out from behind the table, blocking my path, attempting to handle the situation before her wealthy future in-laws realized there was a disruption. "What are you doing here?" Jada hissed, keeping her voice low but frantic. "Security is supposed to keep the trash out. You are not on the guest list." I looked down at her. "I do not need an invitation to address my family's business, Jada." Connor noticed the commotion and stepped up beside his fiancée, wrapping a protective, possessive arm around her waist. He looked at me with the same condescending smirk he had worn the night before in my father's living room. Connor's father, a silver-haired titan of the commercial real estate industry, paused his conversation and turned his attention toward us, a puzzled frown creasing his forehead. Jada quickly plastered on a fake, overly bright smile, turning to Connor and his father to perform her damage control. "Connor, Mr. Sterling, I am so sorry about this interruption. This is my tragic stepsister, Kendra. She works a boring, low-level desk job, looking at old papers all day. She has always been incredibly jealous of our success. Please do not let her beg you for a handout. It is embarrassing." Connor chuckled, a deep, resonant sound of pure white corporate arrogance. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal whiskey glass, looking me up and down, as if calculating my market value and finding it severely lacking. "It is quite all right, Jada," Connor said, his voice carrying the sickening tone of a magnanimous savior. "I understand times are tough for people who lack ambition. Look, Kendra, my family is very generous. We are building a massive state-of-the-art clubhouse on that farm we just bought from your father. We will need staff. I am sure we can find a position for you. Perhaps as a receptionist or a coat check girl. Did you bring your resume to our engagement party?" Several of the executives at the table laughed politely, amused by Connor's sharp wit. Desmond and Valerie stood frozen behind them, panic bleeding through their polished facades. They knew I was not there to beg for a job. I did not shed a tear. I did not raise my voice or react to the racial and classist undertones of his insult. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my expression completely blank. I unclasped the brass lock on my leather briefcase. "No, Connor. I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a steel blade. I brought a map. I pulled a thick, tightly rolled document from my briefcase. I stepped around Jada, completely ignoring her gasp of outrage, and slammed the heavy parchment down onto the center of their VIP table. I unrolled it with a sharp flick of my wrists, deliberately knocking over Jada's half-empty champagne flute in the process. The sparkling liquid spilled across the white linen tablecloth, but I did not apologize. I flattened the edges of the document and looked directly at Connor's father, the CEO of the development firm, the man who actually controlled the billions of dollars funding this project. Mr. Sterling. I addressed him clearly and professionally. This is an official certified federal land survey map of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm, the property your firm is attempting to purchase. Mr. Sterling set his drink down, his business instincts instantly overriding the social setting. He leaned forward, examining the intricate topographical lines and state seals stamped across the bottom of the map. I tapped my index finger firmly against the lower quadrant of the printed land. I strongly suggest your legal team review the soil composition on the south acreage of the farm, specifically the exact location where your son has proudly slated the foundation for your new clubhouse. Connor scoffed, trying to dismiss me. We have run standard surveys. The land is perfectly viable for commercial construction. You do not know what you are talking about, reception girl. I am a senior title examiner, Connor. I corrected him, my voice ringing with absolute authority. And standard surveys do not always catch federal designations hidden in archive annexes. The soil composition in that specific quadrant classifies the entire southern border of the farm as a federally protected wetland under the Environmental Protection Agency guidelines. The color completely drained from Mr. Sterling's face. As a veteran developer, he knew exactly what those words meant. I continued, ensuring every corporate investor at the table heard me clearly. Any commercial construction demolition or disruption of that soil without a specialized Tier 4 environmental permit is a direct violation of federal law. A permit of that magnitude takes an average of 3 to 5 years to acquire and requires public hearings, environmental impact studies, and congressional oversight. Your multi-million-dollar golf community is dead in the water. If you break ground on Wednesday, your entire firm will face federal indictment. The silence at the VIP table was absolute. The string quartet continued playing in the corner, but the powerful men and women surrounding me were entirely paralyzed. Mr. Sterling glared at Connor, his eyes flashing with lethal corporate fury. Connor stammered, trying to formulate a defense, his arrogant smirk entirely erased. Before anyone could speak, Desmond lunged forward. His face was contorted with violent rage. He grabbed my upper arm with a bruising grip, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep through the fabric of my suit. "You vindictive, lying brat!" Desmond hissed, his spit hitting my cheek as he attempted to physically drag me away from the table. "You are trying to ruin my life again. I am the legal executor of your mother's estate. I hold the master deed, I own that land, and I decide what happens to it. I will destroy your career for this." I planted my feet, refusing to be moved. I yanked my arm forward with a sharp, forceful twist, breaking his grip instantly. I smoothed the sleeve of my emerald suit, completely unbothered by his physical intimidation. I stepped closer to him, invading his space, looking him dead in the eye, while his wealthy buyers watched our every move. "Are you absolutely sure about that, Desmond?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, carrying a sinister edge that made him physically recoil. "Are you absolutely sure you own that land?" Desmond blinked, his chest heaving as he tried to maintain his dominance. "I have the deed." I smiled, a slow, terrifying curve of my lips. "Because I spent all day reviewing the county archives," I told him, making sure Connor and his father heard every single syllable. "And the signature on your supposed master deed was dated and notarized exactly 3 days after my mother's funeral." The silence that followed my words was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that sucks the oxygen out of a room. Desmond's face went completely slack, the color draining from his cheeks until he looked physically ill. The vein in his neck pulsed wildly, but his mouth opened and closed without a single sound escaping. Connor's father, a veteran titan of the commercial real estate industry, was a man who built his empire on airtight contracts and bulletproof deeds. He instantly recognized the sheer, unadulterated terror in my father's eyes. A forged deed attached to a federal wetland violation was not just a deal-breaker. It was a developer's worst nightmare, a straight path to federal prison. Connor stammered, trying to formulate a defense, his arrogant smirk entirely erased from his face. He looked at Desmond for reassurance, but Desmond was paralyzed. Before anyone could speak another word, Connor's father held up a single sharp hand, silencing his son instantly. He leaned back in his leather chair, staring at Desmond with sudden icy suspicion. I did not wait for my father to formulate a lie. I did not wait for the inevitable screaming match. I simply snapped the brass locks of my briefcase shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot over the quiet melodies of the string quartet. I turned my back on the VIP table and walked out of the ballroom, every step measured calm and unhurried. Behind me, the frantic, panicked whispering began. The adrenaline was still buzzing in my veins the next morning as I arrived at my office. My title agency was located on the second floor of a sleek corporate building in downtown Atlanta. It was a place of quiet professionalism, hushed voices, the smell of fresh coffee, and the endless rustle of legal documents. I was sitting at my desk organizing the files for my morning reviews and enjoying the peace when I heard the unmistakable sound of shouting coming from the reception area. It was shrill, entitled, and aggressively loud. It was a voice that had haunted my teenage years. I stepped out of my office and walked down the corridor. Standing in the center of our pristine, glass-walled lobby was Valerie. She looked completely unhinged. She was wearing a blindingly bright designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses, clutching a crocodile skin handbag like a weapon. The moment she spotted me walking toward her, her face contorted with absolute fury. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her diamond rings catching the lobby lights. "There she is!" Valerie screamed, her voice echoing off the marble floors, causing paralegals and clients to stop dead in their tracks. "You ungrateful, lying little thief. I want you fired immediately. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this miserable establishment." I stood my ground, keeping my hands loosely clasped in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. "Valerie, you are making a scene in a professional environment. You need to leave before I have security remove you. I am not going anywhere until you are carrying your things out of here in a cardboard box," she sneered, taking an aggressive step toward me. She turned to our wide-eyed receptionist, slamming her hand on the front desk. "This woman is mentally unstable. She has been harassing my husband, extorting our family, and trying to sabotage a multi-million-dollar business deal out of sheer, bitter jealousy. She is a fraud, and if you do not terminate her right this second, my husband will sue this agency into bankruptcy." Before Valerie could launch into another vicious tirade, the heavy oak doors of the corner office swung open. Mr. Sterling stepped out. He was our senior compliance officer and agency director. He was a man who had spent 20 years as a ruthless real estate attorney before moving into title insurance. He was meticulous, entirely devoid of humor when it came to the law, and absolutely intolerant of workplace drama. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Valerie with a mixture of profound confusion and deep annoyance. "I am the director here," Mr. Sterling said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that commanded instant respect. "And I strongly suggest you lower your voice, madam. What exactly is the meaning of this disruption on my floor?" Instantly, Valerie's entire demeanor changed. The aggressive, screaming woman vanished, replaced in a heartbeat by a trembling, distressed victim. It was the exact same performance she used to pull on my father whenever she wanted me grounded, punished, or ignored. She took off her sunglasses, her eyes wide and pleading, playing the part of the wealthy, besieged socialite to perfection. "Sir, I am so deeply sorry to bring this ugliness to your doorstep," Valerie said, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion. "My name is Valerie Harrison. My husband is a very prominent businessman in this city. Kendra is his estranged daughter. We have tried for years to help her, to get her the psychological support she so clearly needs, but she refuses. Last night, she crashed a private family event and started screaming insane delusions about our property. She is using her position at your company to look up our private financial records and stalk us. She is dangerous and she is a massive legal liability to your firm." Mr. Sterling frowned, turning his sharp, calculating gaze toward me. In the title industry, accessing public records for personal vendettas or harassment is a massive ethical violation. It is grounds for immediate termination and the revoking of a state license. Valerie knew exactly what buttons to push to sound credible to a corporate manager. She thought because she had wealth and a husband in a tailored suit, the world would automatically side with her over a young working-class black woman. She expected me to panic, to cry, to get defensive and scream back, which would only prove her point that I was unstable and emotional. I did not panic. I looked at Mr. Sterling, my expression completely serene. "Mr. Sterling," I said calmly, projecting my voice so the entire lobby could hear, "as you know, every search we perform in the county database is logged, tracked, and perfectly legal. I have not accessed a single private financial record. However, since Mrs. Harrison has decided to publicly accuse me of professional misconduct and extortion in front of our clients and our staff, I believe we should clarify the matter right here and now." I walked past Valerie, completely ignoring her dramatic gasp of outrage, and approached the large interactive presentation monitor mounted on the lobby wall. It was typically used to walk elite clients through complex boundary surveys and title chains. I picked up the wireless keyboard and mouse resting on the console beneath it. I logged into my credentials, bringing up the live public portal of the county clerk's real estate records. The massive screen illuminated the lobby, casting a bright, unforgiving glow over Valerie's suddenly pale face. "Let us look at the public record, Valerie," I said. I typed in the address of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. The property history populated on the massive screen in bold, undeniable black and white. I clicked on the digital scan of the master deed, the exact document Desmond had waved in my face years ago, to claim ownership, the document that gave him the right to sell the land to Connor's family. "Mr. Sterling, you are an expert in compliance," I said, stepping aside so my boss had a clear, unobstructed view of the screen. "This is the deed transferring ownership of my late mother's ancestral farm entirely to my father, Desmond Harrison. As you can see, my mother's signature is at the bottom, releasing all her marital and ancestral rights to the property." Mr. Sterling stepped closer, his eyes scanning the digital document with practiced speed. "All right. It appears to be a standard transfer." "What is the issue, Kendra?" I clicked the mouse, zooming in on the bottom right corner of the document. The notary stamp and the date filled the massive screen. "Look at the date of the notarization, sir. September 14th. I opened a second tab and pulled up a digital scan of a death certificate from the State Vital Records public database. I dragged the window and projected it right beside the deed so they were side by side. "And this is my mother's official death certificate. Date of death, September 11th. A collective gasp echoed through the lobby from the paralegals and clients watching the screens. Mr. Sterling froze, his eyes darting rapidly between the two dates. "A dead woman cannot sign a deed, Mr. Sterling," I said, the cold, hard truth ringing out in the quiet room. "And a dead woman certainly cannot stand before a notary public and present a valid photo identification 3 days after she has passed away." I did not stop there. I zoomed in tightly on the notary seal itself. But it gets better. If you look closely at the notary's name stamped over the seal, you will see it reads Brenda Miller. Brenda Miller is Valerie's biological sister. I opened a third tab accessing the State Licensing Board's public registry, and according to the State Board, Brenda Miller had her notary license permanently revoked for processing fraudulent vehicle titles exactly 5 years before this document was ever stamped. I turned away from the screen and looked directly at Valerie. She was trembling violently, her jaw slack, her crocodile skin handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. The arrogant, screaming woman had been completely vaporized by the blinding light of public evidence. "You used a revoked notary stamp to forge a dead woman's signature on a property deed, so you and your husband could steal my mother's land," I stated clearly, making sure every single person in the lobby heard the exact mechanics of her crime. "You then attempted to sell that stolen land to a commercial developer for $4.5 million. Mr. Sterling turned slowly to look at Valerie. His face was a mask of absolute, terrifying, professional disgust. He crossed his arms over his chest, his posture rigid. "Ma'am," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dangerously low. "What you have just admitted to, and what my employee has just conclusively proven on the public record, is felony real estate fraud. You have stormed into my place of business, disrupted my staff, and attempted to weaponize my authority to cover up a federal crime." Valerie opened her mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless squeak came out. She took a stumbling step back, her eyes wide with animal terror. "I suggest you leave this premises immediately," Mr. Sterling continued, stepping toward the lobby desk. "Before I call the police and have you arrested for corporate harassment and trespassing. And believe me, I will be forwarding this exact title search to the state prosecutor's office by the end of the hour." Valerie's face drained of all remaining color. The realization that she was completely trapped, that her lies had finally collided with the immovable wall of the public record, shattered her entirely. She spun around, practically scrambling toward the glass revolving doors. In her blind panic to escape the lobby, she twisted her ankle. The heel of her expensive designer shoe snapped off completely with a loud crack. She did not even stop to pick it up. She limped frantically out of the building in absolute crushing disgrace, leaving her dignity shattered on the marble floor. The lobby remained completely silent for a long moment after the glass doors spun to a halt. Mr. Sterling looked at me, uncrossed his arms, and gave me a single, deeply respectful nod before turning back to his office. Just as the heavy oak door clicked shut, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an urgent text message, followed immediately by an incoming email marked with high-priority flags. I did not recognize the sender's number, but the email signature was crystal clear. It was from the lead litigator of Connor's corporate legal team. The screen of my phone glared in the dimming light of the lobby. The email was from the senior litigation partner at Connor's family firm. It was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It contained 3 pages of dense legal jargon outlining a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for tortious interference, slander of title, and corporate espionage. They demanded my presence at an emergency mediation hearing at the county courthouse on Wednesday morning. The threat was explicit: sign the quitclaim deed and surrender all rights to the farm, or they would bankrupt me with litigation until I was sleeping on the pavement. They assumed because I was a young single black woman without a massive corporate law firm standing behind me, I would fold under the sheer weight of their wealth and aggression. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. They were right about one thing. Wednesday morning was going to be an absolute bloodbath, but I was not the one who was going to bleed. I knew Desmond. I knew that the moment the panic wore off, he would call his own lawyers. He would claim the revoked notary stamp was a tragic clerical error made by a grieving husband navigating a confusing probate system. He would try to legitimize the forged deed by burying the truth under mountains of legal paperwork and endless court delays funded by Connor's family. Digital files were too fragile. They could be contested, argued over, or dismissed by a judge sympathetic to wealthy developers. I needed the bedrock. I needed the original, unaltered truth. That night, I did not go home to my apartment. I drove straight to the county records building. It was past 10 o'clock, and the brutalist concrete structure was mostly dark and silent. I used my employee security clearance badge to bypass the main security desk, taking the freight elevator all the way down to the sub-basement. This was the belly of the beast, a place where digital convenience had not yet erased the physical weight of history. The air down there was thick and heavy, smelling of aged paper dust and cold ozone. Row upon row of massive metal filing cabinets stretched into the shadows. I walked past the modern computer terminals and headed straight for the deepest, dustiest corner of the archives. I switched on the overhead fluorescent lights. They flickered and hummed, casting a sterile white glow over the vintage microfiche readers. I pulled the heavy archive logs from the shelf and began hunting for the specific reels from the late 1980s and early 90s. The years before my mother got sick. The years she was still fiercely protective of her legacy. I found the heavy metal canisters I needed, loaded the first spool of acetate film into the machine, and turned on the projector. The blinding white square of the screen illuminated my face in the dark room. For 3 hours, the only sound was the mechanical whir and clatter of the reel spinning forward. I scoured through thousands of property transfers, tax assessments, and boundary maps, my eyes burning from the harsh glare. I was looking for the root of the title, a foundational document that predated Desmond's entire existence in our family. Just after 1 in the morning, my breath hitched in my chest. I stopped the reel, my hands trembling slightly, as I adjusted the focus knob. The document leaped into sharp clarity on the screen. It was not just a standard property deed. My mother was brilliant. She knew exactly what kind of man she had married. She knew his greed was a bottomless pit that would eventually consume everything she loved. She had not just left me a farm. She had locked it inside an impenetrable legal fortress. The document was an official registration establishing the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm as a protected historical Black-owned land trust. But the second page was the true weapon. It was an irrevocable trust document drafted and finalized 2 years before she died, right around the time she first caught Desmond cheating with Valerie. She had transferred the master title of the land directly into the trust. The terms were absolute and undeniable. The property bypassed probate entirely and was to be held securely by a neutral third party until my 25th birthday, at which point I became the sole undisputed owner. Furthermore, there was a specific ironclad clause explicitly stripping Desmond of any and all marital rights to the property due to documented infidelity and financial abuse. His forged deed was not just a fake. It was a completely worthless piece of paper trying to claim land that had not belonged to my mother's personal estate for over a decade. Desmond's entire claim to the land was a phantom. He owned absolutely nothing. I hit the print button on the microfiche machine. The heavy certified printer groaned to life, spitting out thick watermarked copies of the undeniable proof. As I gathered the warm pages, sliding them carefully into my leather briefcase, my phone chimed in the quiet room. It was a social media alert. Against my better judgment, I opened the app. Jada had just posted a live video. She and Connor were standing in the middle of my mother's sprawling green pasture, dressed in expensive designer casual wear, holding crystal flutes of champagne. Connor's arm was wrapped tightly around her waist as they smiled smugly into the camera. They were announcing to their thousands of followers that the demolition of the old useless farm would officially begin on Thursday morning. Jada leaned into the lens, her eyes gleaming with malice, and openly mocked the bitter, broke relative who simply could not let go of the past and was trying to ruin their happiness. She laughed, telling her followers that some people just did not belong in the winner's circle and needed to learn their place. I watched the video twice, my expression completely blank. I did not engage with her online drama. I did not leave a comment or react to the provocation. I simply closed the app, opened my email, and found the massive, threatening lawsuit message from Connor's lead attorney demanding my absolute surrender at Wednesday's mediation. I hit reply. I did not type out a legal defense or a plea for mercy. I simply typed 2 words. See you. I locked my phone, turned off the microfiche reader, and walked out of the archives into the cool night air. Wednesday was going to be an unforgettable day. I left the Oakmont Country Club that night knowing the earth had shifted permanently beneath their feet. The look of absolute terror on my father's face and the corporate fury burning in the eyes of Connor's father told me everything I needed to know. The multi-million-dollar golf course development was completely paralyzed, trapped behind federal environmental regulations and the sudden glaring shadow of a forged deed. I drove back to my apartment with my hands perfectly steady on the steering wheel. The bomb had been dropped. I knew the fallout would be swift and vicious, but I expected it to arrive in the form of a cease and desist letter, or a threatening phone call from a team of high-priced corporate litigators. I vastly underestimated Valerie's capacity for unhinged, impulsive vindictiveness. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life getting exactly what she wanted by screaming until the world simply surrendered to her demands. The next morning, the sky over Atlanta was a flat, unforgiving gray. The title agency where I worked occupied the entire second floor of a sleek corporate building downtown. It was a sanctuary of quiet professionalism, defined by hushed voices, the smell of dark roasted coffee, and the endless comforting rustle of legal documents. In the real estate title industry, reputation and discretion are the absolute bedrock of the business. We handle millions of dollars in escrow-sensitive personal data and complex property disputes. The environment is strictly regulated, and any hint of instability or ethical breach is grounds for immediate termination. I had spent years meticulously building my reputation in this office, proving myself as a precise, reliable, and entirely unproblematic employee. My morning started like any other. I was at my desk by 8 o'clock, pulling up preliminary title reports on my dual monitors, enjoying the quiet hum of the waking office. At exactly 9:15, the serenity of the agency was violently shattered. The heavy glass doors of our main reception area were practically thrown off their hinges. I heard the sharp, aggressive clatter of stiletto heels hitting the polished marble floor. The sound was so loud, so intentionally disruptive in our quiet workspace, that my fingers immediately stopped typing. A shrill, entitled voice echoed down the corridor, a voice that had haunted the darkest corners of my teenage years. "Where is she? Where is the little thief?" Valerie screamed at the top of her lungs. I stood up, smoothed the front of my skirt, and stepped out of my cubicle. I walked down the long, carpeted corridor toward the reception desk. Valerie was standing in the exact center of our pristine lobby, demanding the attention of every single person in the room. She was wearing a blindingly bright crimson designer trench coat, oversized sunglasses, and she was clutching a heavy crocodile skin handbag as if she intended to use it as a blunt weapon. Several paralegals had frozen in the hallway, clutching their files to their chests. Two elite commercial clients sitting in the leather waiting chairs had lowered their portfolios, staring in absolute shock. Chloe, our young receptionist, was practically pressed against the back wall of her desk, her hand hovering nervously near the security panic button. The moment Valerie spotted me walking calmly toward the front desk, her face contorted with a mixture of triumph and absolute fury. She marched toward me, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest, her diamond rings catching the harsh overhead lights. "There she is!" Valerie shrieked, her voice bouncing off the glass walls. "You ungrateful, lying little thief! I want you fired immediately. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this miserable establishment right this second." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the fear she so desperately wanted to extract from me. I stopped 3 feet away from her, keeping my hands loosely and professionally clasped in front of me. "Valerie, you are making a massive scene in a professional environment," I said, my voice low and perfectly measured. "You need to leave this building immediately before I have building security forcibly remove you from the premises." Valerie let out a harsh, barking laugh, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I am not going anywhere until you are carrying your cheap little desk ornaments out of here in a cardboard box." She spun around dramatically, addressing Chloe and the stunned clients in the waiting area, playing to her captive audience. "This woman is completely mentally unstable. She is a dangerous, bitter little girl who has been harassing my successful husband and extorting our family for months. Last night, she illegally crashed our private engagement party and tried to sabotage a multi-million-dollar business deal out of sheer deranged jealousy. She is a fraud and a criminal. And if you do not terminate her employment right this second, my husband will sue this agency into absolute bankruptcy." Before Valerie could take another breath for her next tirade, the heavy oak doors of the corner office swung open. The atmosphere in the lobby instantly dropped by 10 degrees. Mr. Sterling stepped out into the corridor. He was our senior compliance officer and the agency director. Mr. Sterling was a man who had spent 20 years as a ruthless commercial real estate attorney before moving into the title insurance sector. He was meticulous, entirely devoid of humor when it came to the letter of the law, and absolutely intolerant of workplace drama. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his gaze sweeping over the paralyzed staff, the wide-eyed clients, and finally settling on the woman screaming in the center of his lobby. "I am the director here," Mr. Sterling said, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that commanded instant, terrified respect. "And I strongly suggest you lower your voice, madam. What exactly is the meaning of this disruption on my floor? Instantly, Valerie's entire demeanor shifted. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The aggressive, screaming woman vanished into thin air, replaced in a heartbeat by a trembling, deeply distressed victim. It was the exact same performance she used to pull on my father whenever she wanted me grounded, punished, or ignored during my childhood. She pulled off her oversized sunglasses, revealing eyes that were already welling with calculated crocodile tears. She pressed a trembling hand against her chest, playing the part of the wealthy besieged socialite to absolute perfection. "Sir, I am so deeply sorry to bring this terrible ugliness to your doorstep," Valerie said, her voice shaking with manufactured breathy emotion. "My name is Valerie Harrison. My husband Desmond is a very prominent and respected businessman in this city. Kendra is his estranged daughter. We have tried for years to help her to get her the psychological support she so clearly needs, but she refuses us at every turn." Valerie sniffled, wiping a delicate tear from her cheek as she stepped closer to Mr. Sterling, treating him like a confidant. Last night, she crashed a private family celebration and started screaming insane, violent delusions about our property. "Sir, she is using her position at your company to look up our private financial records and stalk our family. She is trying to steal from us. She is dangerous, she is unwell, and she is a massive legal liability to your firm. You have to stop her before she hurts someone." Mr. Sterling frowned, his posture stiffening. He turned his sharp, calculating gaze toward me. The stakes in that room were incredibly high. In the title industry, accessing public records for personal vendettas or unauthorized harassment is considered a massive ethical violation. It is a fireable offense and can lead to the permanent revocation of a state examining license. Valerie knew exactly what she was doing. She knew exactly what corporate buzzwords to use to trigger an executive's fear of liability. She fully expected me to panic. She expected me to cry, to get defensive, to start screaming back at her, which would only prove her point to my boss that I was unstable, emotional, and entirely unprofessional. She thought because she had wealth and a husband in a tailored suit, the world would automatically side with her over a young black woman working a desk job. I did not panic. I did not defend my character or call her a liar. I simply looked at Mr. Sterling, my expression completely serene, my voice devoid of any emotional waver. "Mr. Sterling," I said, calmly projecting my voice so every single person in the lobby could hear my defense. "As you know, every single search we perform in the county clerk database is logged, tracked, and perfectly legal. I have never accessed a single private financial record. However, since Mrs. Harrison has decided to storm into our office and publicly accuse me of professional misconduct, extortion, and theft in front of our clients and our staff, I believe we should clarify this matter right here and now." I walked past Valerie, completely ignoring her dramatic, offended gasp as I brushed by her shoulder. I approached the large interactive presentation monitor mounted on the far wall of the lobby. It was a massive high-definition screen typically used by our senior partners to walk elite commercial clients through complex boundary surveys and convoluted title chains. I picked up the wireless keyboard and mouse resting on the sleek console beneath the screen. I quickly logged into my secure employee credentials, bypassing the agency intranet and bringing up the live public portal of the county clerk's real estate records. The massive screen flared to life, illuminating the dim lobby and casting a bright, unforgiving blue glow over Valerie's suddenly pale, confused face. I turned to look at my stepmother, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard. "Let us look at the public record, Valerie." The massive 70-inch presentation monitor flared to life, casting a stark, hyper-focused white light across the dim, polished marble of the lobby. Every paralegal, every executive, and the two wealthy clients sitting in the waiting area were completely paralyzed, their eyes locked onto the screen. I stood at the console, my fingers dancing across the wireless keyboard with the practiced mechanical precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I did not look at Valerie. I did not need to. Her panicked, erratic breathing was loud enough to echo in the cavernous room. I bypassed the standard search parameters and logged directly into the county clerk's back-end administrative portal, and access tier reserved exclusively for senior title examiners and compliance officers. Parcel ID 44-892. I announced, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. Specifically, we are looking at the historical chain of title and the corresponding tax assessment records. The screen populated with rows of digital data, a sprawling spreadsheet of property history that stretched back decades. I scrolled past the years of my mother's meticulous tax payments, moving directly to the chaotic, murky timeline following her death. In the state of Georgia, altering a property deed requires strict verification, I explained, maintaining direct eye contact with Mr. Sterling. Desmond Harrison could not simply transfer the estate to Connor's development firm without clearing the title. To clear the title, he needed to establish undisputed administrative control over the property, and to do that he needed an accomplice. I clicked a specific highlighted link. A high-resolution scan of a heavily redacted legal document filled the center of the screen. Document 884-B, I stated, a comprehensive power of attorney filed with the county clerk. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She took a step backward, her expensive crocodile handbag slipping down to her forearm. "Shut it off," she hissed, her voice stripped of all its previous bravado, reduced to a desperate, shaking whisper. "You do not have the right to show my private information. Turn that screen off immediately." Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He kept his eyes locked on the projected document, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Continue, Kendra," he ordered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "This power of attorney supposedly grants Valerie Harrison full, unrestricted administrative control over the Cecilia Harrison estate," I said, dragging the digital magnifying tool over the bottom half of the document. It allowed her to append her own name to the property tax rolls. By paying the back taxes under her name, she established a fraudulent paper trail of ownership which Desmond then used to validate his forged deed to Connor's firm. I turned to face Valerie, pinning her to the spot with a dead, unwavering stare. "But you were sloppy, Valerie," I told her. "You thought because you were dealing with a rural county clerk's office, nobody would ever check the digital metadata behind the filing. You thought the title insurance agency would simply rubber stamp a multi-million-dollar commercial transfer without verifying the foundational paperwork." I tapped the keyboard, pulling up the digital filing log attached to the power of attorney. The raw data cascaded down the right side of the screen in bright green text. "Look at the timestamp, Mr. Sterling," I said, stepping aside. "This power of attorney was electronically filed on November 12th at precisely 2:14 p.m. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, his eyes narrowing as he read the data. "I see the timestamp. What is the discrepancy?" "The discrepancy, sir, is the IP address from which the document was uploaded," I replied, highlighting a specific string of numbers on the screen. "I ran a trace on this IP address yesterday afternoon. This document was not uploaded from a law firm. It was not uploaded from the county courthouse. It was uploaded from a private commercial Wi-Fi network registered to Valerie's Boutique, a high-end retail clothing store located in Buckhead, a store entirely owned and operated by the woman standing in our lobby." The silence in the room was absolute. The two commercial clients in the waiting area slowly lowered their coffee cups, staring at Valerie as if she were a live explosive. I clicked one final time, bringing up the signature block of the power of attorney. "And finally, the signature of the authorizing witness," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "It belongs to a notary whose commission expired 3 years prior to the date on this document. You used an expired invalid notary seal to authorize a fraudulent power of attorney, uploaded it from your own retail clothing store, and used it to illegally append your name to my mother's property taxes. You manufactured a fake chain of title to steal land, and then you walked into my place of business to try and get me fired so I could not expose you." I took my hands off the keyboard and stepped away from the console. The digital evidence loomed over us, 70 inches of undeniable, irrefutable felony fraud. Mr. Sterling turned slowly. He looked at Valerie with a level of utter, profound disgust that seemed to physically strip the designer clothes right off her back. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the sanctity of property law, and he was currently looking at someone who had treated the county registry like her own personal playground. Valerie's face had completely drained of color. The heavy layer of expensive foundation she wore could not hide the chalky, sickly white hue of pure panic spreading across her cheeks. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "Ma'am," Mr. Sterling said, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "What you have just admitted to and what my employee has just conclusively proven on our premises is real estate fraud. It is a Class C felony." Valerie shook her head frantically, her oversized sunglasses slipping down her nose. "No, you do not understand. My husband handled the paperwork. I just signed where I was told. I did not know it was illegal. She is setting me up." "Do not insult my intelligence," Mr. Sterling snapped, taking a single intimidating step toward her. "You deliberately bypassed due diligence, forged administrative control over a deceased woman's estate, and then attempted to weaponize my authority to terminate the only title examiner smart enough to catch you. That is corporate harassment, that is extortion, and that is grand theft." He turned to our young receptionist, who was watching the scene with wide, terrified eyes. "Chloe," Mr. Sterling ordered sharply, "call building security. Tell them we have a hostile trespasser on the floor. Then connect me directly to the Fulton County District Attorney's office. I want the White-Collar Crime Division on the line." The word police broke the final remaining thread of Valerie's sanity. The wealthy, entitled socialite illusion shattered into a million jagged pieces. Absolute primitive survival instinct took over. She let out a high-pitched, terrifying shriek, dropping her crocodile handbag onto the floor. She spun around, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity, and bolted for the exit. She scrambled toward the heavy glass revolving doors with the frantic, uncoordinated desperation of a cornered animal. In her blind panic to escape the building before security arrived, she misjudged the heavy rotation of the glass panels. She slammed her shoulder hard against the door, her foot slipping on the polished metal track of the entranceway. The heel of her $500 designer shoe became wedged in the floor grate. As she forcefully yanked her leg forward to keep running, the stiletto heel snapped off completely with a loud, violent crack. Valerie stumbled forward, nearly face-planting onto the concrete plaza outside. She did not stop. She did not turn around to retrieve her broken shoe or her abandoned handbag. She simply hobbled away as fast as her uneven legs could carry her, a chaotic, lopsided sprint toward the parking garage, fleeing in absolute crushing disgrace. The heavy glass doors slowly spun to a halt, leaving the lobby in total stunned silence. The only evidence that Valerie had ever been there was a single broken black heel resting in the metal grate and a discarded designer handbag sitting sadly on the marble floor. Mr. Sterling exhaled a long, heavy breath, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. He turned to me, his expression softening just a fraction, though his eyes remained deadly serious. "Lock that digital file, Kendra," Mr. Sterling said quietly. "Download the entire data packet, burn it to an encrypted drive, and bring it to my office in 10 minutes. We are sending a courier to the state prosecutor before lunch." "Yes, sir," I replied, maintaining my professional posture. "And Kendra," he added, pausing with his hand on his office door. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." "Excellent work." He walked into his office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. The lobby slowly began to thaw. The paralegals let out a collective breath they had been holding, returning to their desks with hurried, hushed whispers. The two commercial clients in the waiting area looked at me with a newfound silent reverence, before burying their faces back in their portfolios. I walked back to the console, logged out of the county database, and cleared the massive presentation screen. I bent down, picked up Valerie's abandoned handbag, and placed it securely behind the reception desk for building security to confiscate. The adrenaline that had been keeping me perfectly steady was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I had won the battle in the lobby, but the war was far from over. Valerie was a pawn. Desmond was a coward. But Connor and his father controlled a billion-dollar corporate empire, and they were not going to let a prime piece of real estate slip through their fingers simply because of a fraudulent deed. They had armies of lawyers who specialized in burying problems under mountains of cash. I walked back down the quiet corridor to my cubicle. I sat down in my ergonomic chair, the familiar comfort of my desk grounding me. Before I could even reach for my mouse to begin compiling the encrypted drive for Mr. Sterling, my phone vibrated violently against the laminate wood of my desk. It was not a subtle notification. It was a harsh, continuous buzz, indicating an emergency priority alert. I picked up the phone and looked at the lock screen. It was a direct text message sent through a secure encrypted corporate gateway. I did not recognize the sender's number, but I recognized the aggressive legalistic formatting instantly. It was from the lead litigation partner at Connor's corporate law firm. They were not sending an email this time. They were bypassing formal channels entirely. The wetland trap I had sprung at the country club, combined with the catastrophic collapse of their fraudulent title, had finally pushed the billionaires into a state of panic. I unlocked the screen and opened the message. It was a direct text from Connor. It was not a formal legal notice, but a venomous, arrogant threat sent directly to my personal number. You think a broken heel and a fake notary stamp are going to stop a $50 million development project, the message read. My father's legal team is preparing a response that will bury you. You have no idea what kind of power you just challenged. You are going to lose everything. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket, my expression completely unchanged. Connor was an entitled, arrogant child, but he was not wrong about the sheer destructive power of his family's wealth. Valerie's sloppy digital forgery had been exposed, humiliating her and stalling the immediate demolition, but Desmond could still attempt to assert standard spousal inheritance rights over the land. He could claim he was the rightful heir to my mother's estate, regardless of the forged deed. With Connor's billionaire father funding his legal fees, Desmond could drag this dispute through the probate courts for a decade. They would bury me under mountains of injunctions, appeals, and endless litigation until the legal costs bled me dry and forced me to surrender the farm just to survive. If I wanted to stop their bulldozers permanently, proving Valerie was a fraud was only half the battle. I needed to prove that my mother had completely and legally severed Desmond from the property long before she drew her last breath. I needed the undeniable, immutable origin of the title. I needed the physical bedrock of the law. And I knew exactly where it was buried. That evening, long after the rest of the title agency had gone home and the city of Atlanta had settled into the quiet dark, I drove to the County Records Administration building. It was a massive, brutalist concrete structure that housed the entire registered history of the district. I used my senior examiner's security clearance badge to bypass the night guards at the front desk. I did not head toward the brightly lit modern digital records department on the third floor. Digital files were convenient, but they were vulnerable. They could be hacked, manipulated, redacted, or conveniently misfiled by corrupt clerks looking for a payout from wealthy commercial developers. I walked past the bank of modern elevators and unlocked the heavy reinforced steel door leading to the emergency stairwell. I descended deep into the sub-basement. This was the true archive, the forgotten belly of the county registry system. Down here, the air was thick, heavy, and freezing cold, carrying the distinct metallic scent of ozone dust and decaying paper. Row upon endless row of towering olive-green metal filing cabinets stretched out into the absolute darkness, housing the physical records that existed before the world went completely digital. The original microfiche reels from the 1980s and 90s were locked in time down here. They were the undisputed, unalterable foundation of every single piece of property in the state. I walked down the dark, narrow aisles, my footsteps echoing sharply against the bare concrete floor. I reached the far back corner of the subterranean room and pulled the heavy chain attached to the overhead fluorescent light. The long glass tubes flickered violently, buzzing with a low mechanical hum as they bathed the row of vintage microfiche readers in a harsh, sterile white glow. I pulled the heavy leather-bound archive indices from the bottom shelf, blowing a thin layer of dust from the cover. I ran my finger down the dense columns of handwritten property codes, meticulously cross-referencing the lot numbers and municipal coordinates for the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. Once I had the exact volume number, I walked over to the reinforced steel drawers and pulled out 3 heavy metal canisters containing the acetate film reels from the years immediately preceding my mother's death. I sat down at the cold metal desk, loaded the first spool of film into the reader, and threaded the delicate acetate carefully through the glass presentation plates. I flipped the heavy power switch. The projector bulb flared to life with a sharp click, throwing a bright, glaring square of light onto the frosted glass screen, illuminating my face in the dark, silent room. For the next 4 hours, the only sound in the entire sub-basement was the rhythmic mechanical whir and clatter of the reels spinning forward and backward. It was a tense, agonizingly meticulous search. I leaned close to the screen, my eyes burning and watering from the intense, unyielding glare of the backlight. I scoured through thousands of micro-photographed pages. I read through mundane tax assessments, minor boundary adjustments, agricultural zoning ordinances, and municipal water right transfers. I watched the bureaucratic history of the county fly by in a dizzying blur of black and white text, searching for a single defining needle in a massive, sprawling haystack. My mother was a fiercely intelligent, pragmatic woman. She knew exactly what kind of man she had married. She knew Desmond's greed was a bottomless pit, and she knew that the moment her health failed, he would try to consume everything she had spent her life cultivating. I knew in my bones that she would not have left her ancestral land vulnerable to standard probate laws. She would have built a legal fortress around it. I just had to find the original blueprints. At exactly 1:40 in the morning, my breath hitched sharply in my throat. My hand froze instantly on the rotational dial. I reversed the heavy reel half an inch, holding my breath as I carefully adjusted the focus knob until the blurry typewritten text snapped into razor-sharp clarity. There it was. It was not a standard property deed. It was a comprehensive, highly specialized legal filing that Desmond had absolutely no idea existed. The first page was an official state and federal registration establishing the entire south acreage of the farm as a protected historical black-owned land trust. This designation alone carried heavy, virtually impenetrable developmental restrictions designed to prevent predatory corporate gentrification. But it was the second document that made my heart hammer wildly against my ribs. It was an irrevocable trust agreement. My mother had drafted and finalized this document precisely 2 years before her passing, right around the exact time she first discovered Desmond was secretly funneling money from their joint accounts to fund his affairs. She had not left the farm and her personal estate to be divided up by a judge in probate court. She had transferred the master title of the land entirely into this untouchable trust. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, reading the dense, magnificent legal clauses. The terms were absolute, ironclad, and entirely bulletproof. The property was placed under the strict protection of a neutral state-appointed fiduciary trustee. The document explicitly stated that upon my mother's death, the land would be held securely and completely untouched until my 25th birthday. Upon reaching that exact age, a milestone I had crossed just 2 weeks ago, I would become the sole, undisputed, and exclusive owner of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. I scrolled down to the final section of the trust, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across my face. My mother had included a specific, deeply detailed exclusionary clause. Because the land was ancestral, predating their marriage by decades, and because she cited documented evidence of his financial abuse, she explicitly stripped Desmond of any and all marital rights, spousal claims, and executor privileges regarding the property. The revelation was staggering in its absolute finality. Desmond's entire claim to the land was a total phantom. He did not own the farm. He had never owned the farm. He had spent the last 7 years walking around like the lord of the manor, bullying me, threatening my career, and negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts with Connor's father, all based on a piece of land that he had absolutely zero legal right to sell, touch, or even inhabit. He was nothing but a trespasser on my property. I reached out and hit the heavy print button on the side of the microfiche machine. The large industrial printer beneath the desk groaned and clattered to life. It began spitting out thick, certified, watermarked copies of the undeniable proof. I gathered the warm pages, feeling the heavy physical weight of my mother's ultimate protection in my hands. I carefully slid the documents into my leather briefcase, securing the brass locks. The truth was finally mine. Just as my hand closed around the handle of my briefcase, the harsh, bright screen of my cell phone illuminated the dark desk. It was an incoming email flagged with high-priority red exclamation points. The sender address belonged to the senior litigation partner at Connor's father's massive corporate law firm. I opened the message, the glare of the screen reflecting in my tired eyes. It was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. They were officially hitting me with a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for tortious interference, slander of title, and targeted corporate espionage. They demanded my mandatory presence at an emergency mediation meeting at the county courthouse on Wednesday morning. The threat at the bottom of the email was explicit and brutally clear. They demanded I sign a quitclaim deed, surrendering all rights to the farm immediately, or they would tie me up in aggressive litigation for the next decade, promising to completely bankrupt me with legal fees until I had nothing left to my name. The email from Connor's lead litigation partner was a masterpiece of corporate aggression. It was drafted not to inform, but to crush. The subject line blared in bold capitalized letters, "Urgent legal demand and notice of pending litigation." I read the text as the heavy metal door of the county sub-basement clanged shut behind me, locking the vintage archives away in the dark. The email detailed a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit for tortious interference, slander of title, and targeted corporate espionage. They demanded my mandatory presence at an emergency mediation meeting at the county courthouse on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. The final paragraph was the real weapon. They offered a single humiliating out. I was to sign a quitclaim deed, surrendering any and all perceived rights to the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm by Tuesday evening. If I refused, they promised to launch a scorched earth litigation campaign. They would freeze my bank account, subpoena my employer, and bury me in so many legal fees that I would be financially ruined before a judge even looked at the case. I walked out into the cool Atlanta night air, the heavy leather briefcase pulling comfortably at my shoulder. They were operating under a very specific, highly prejudiced assumption. They looked at the board and saw a young, single black woman working a desk job. They assumed I did not have a massive law firm behind me. They assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck, terrified of authority, and easily intimidated by the heavy machinery of the justice system. They expected me to panic, to cry, to call them begging for a fraction of a settlement just to make the nightmare go away. They had no idea that I read threatening legal jargon for a living, and they had absolutely no idea what was currently resting inside my briefcase. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Connor's legal team did not just send emails. They deployed a small army of couriers and process servers to my apartment complex. Starting on Monday morning, the aggressive knocking became a rhythmic soundtrack to my life. Men in cheap suits stood in my hallway, aggressively thrusting thick, heavy manila envelopes into my hands the moment I opened the door. I accepted every single delivery with a blank, unreadable expression. I carried the massive stacks of paper to my kitchen table and sliced them open one by one. The contents were designed to overwhelm the senses. There were notices of deposition, preliminary injunctions, demands for discovery, and cease and desist orders printed on thick, expensive legal bond paper. They referenced obscure state statutes and cited damages in the tens of millions. It was a paper avalanche intended to bury my spirit. To the average citizen, receiving a stack of documents threatening total financial ruin is a paralyzing event. The dense, convoluted language is intentionally designed to make the recipient feel small, helpless, and entirely outmatched. But Connor's high-priced attorneys had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I was a senior compliance officer at an elite title insurance agency. I spent 50 hours a week tearing apart complex legal documents, finding loopholes, exposing fraud, and verifying the bedrock of property law. This was not a foreign language to me. This was my native tongue. I sat at my kitchen table drinking black coffee and read every single page. I read their threats of bankruptcy. I read their arrogant claims of undisputed ownership based on Desmond's fraudulent deed. And with every page I turned, my confidence only hardened into a cold, unbreakable diamond. Their entire massive, terrifying legal assault was built on a foundation of sand. They were firing artillery at a ghost. By Tuesday afternoon, the physical deliveries had stopped, replaced by a new modern form of escalation. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, illuminating with a direct message from an old college friend. It contained a single link to a popular social media platform and a brief concerned note asking if I had seen it yet. I clicked the link. A high-definition video instantly filled my screen, playing to an audience of over 2 million followers. It was Jada. She was Connor's fiancée, a polished, heavily curated social media influencer who made a lucrative living selling the illusion of a perfect wealthy lifestyle. The video opened with a sweeping drone shot of the rolling green pastures and ancient oak trees of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. The camera then cut to Jada, standing directly on the wraparound porch of my mother's farmhouse. She was wearing expensive designer outdoor wear, looking flawlessly manicured against the rustic backdrop. Connor stood just behind her shoulder, pointing at a set of large architectural blueprints, while two men in hard hats nodded eagerly. Jada held the camera close to her face, projecting an expression of exhausted patient victimization. "Hey guys!" She began, her voice dripping with manufactured sincerity. "Connor and I just wanted to give you an update on the new Oakmont Country Club development. We know you've all been so excited to see the groundbreaking." She sighed heavily, brushing a perfectly styled lock of hair behind her ear. "Unfortunately, we've hit a tiny temporary snag. It turns out when you try to build something beautiful and bring jobs to a community, there is always someone trying to tear you down. We are currently dealing with a very bitter, broke relative of the former owner. She is completely obsessed with Connor's family wealth and is throwing a massive, legally baseless temper tantrum because she can't let go of the past." The camera panned over to Connor, who offered the lens a tight, arrogant smile before turning back to his blueprints. "It is honestly just sad," Jada continued, shaking her head tragically. "We offered her a generous settlement out of the goodness of our hearts, but some people would rather play the victim than work for a living. But do not worry, guys. We have the best legal team in the state handling this minor nuisance. The law is entirely on our side." She smiled brightly, and the victim act vanishing in a flash of predatory triumph. "The bulldozers are fueled up and the demolition of this old property officially begins this Thursday. We are not letting one toxic, greedy person stand in the way of progress. Stay tuned for the demolition vlog." The video ended, looping back to the sweeping drone shot of my mother's land. I watched the video 3 times in total silence. I analyzed the background, confirming they had already moved heavy, earth-moving equipment onto the far southern acreage. They were so spectacularly arrogant, so entirely convinced of their own untouchable superiority, that they were publicly broadcasting their intentions to destroy my heritage. Jada's video was a calculated psychological strike. It was designed to publicly humiliate me and create a false narrative of my greed, while simultaneously establishing a ticking clock. Thursday. They were telling me that even if I fought them at the Wednesday mediation, the bulldozers were already in position. They were trying to force a panic-induced surrender. They expected a reaction. They wanted me to post an angry defensive comment. They wanted me to record a tearful response video attempting to clear my name, which they would then use in court to prove I was emotionally unstable and harassing their clients. They needed me to engage in their shallow digital drama to validate their narrative. I gave them absolute silence. I closed the social media application and placed my phone face down on the table. The digital noise, the fake sympathy, the aggressive couriers, the intimidating legal jargon, none of it mattered. It was all smoke and mirrors, a desperate illusion of power masking a fatal vulnerability. I reached for my heavy leather briefcase resting on the chair beside me. I unlatched the brass clasps and carefully pulled out the stack of documents I had printed from the sub-basement microfiche the night before. The pages were thick and crisp, carrying the official raised seal of the county archivist. I ran my fingertips over the bold typewritten header of the irrevocable trust. I read my mother's name, Cecilia Harrison, printed with sharp, undeniable permanence. I read the exclusionary clause that stripped Desmond of all rights, reducing him to a legal phantom. I read the precise, unalterable terms that transferred total, undisputed ownership of the land to me, Kendra Harrison, the moment I turned 25. This was not a social media post. This was not an intimidating corporate threat typed up by a junior associate. This was the law. It was physical, historical, and absolutely lethal. I carefully organized the documents into a sleek black leather presentation portfolio. I smoothed the cover, ensuring every page was perfectly aligned. I had the weapon. Now it was time to step onto the battlefield. I picked up my phone and opened my secure email client. I found the massive, threatening email sent by Connor's lead litigation partner, the one demanding my presence at the courthouse and threatening to bankrupt me if I did not sign away my mother's legacy. I tapped the screen, opening a direct reply. I did not draft a long defensive counter-argument. I did not cite legal precedents or threaten a countersuit. I did not mention Jada's video or Desmond's fraud. I kept my response as cold, sharp, and final as a closing vault door. My fingers tapped the digital keyboard swiftly. See you. The silence that followed my two-word email response was absolute and heavy. By the time Tuesday afternoon arrived, the atmosphere inside my apartment had settled into the quiet, pressurized calm that immediately precedes a hurricane. Connor's high-priced legal team had spent the entirety of Monday attempting to break my spirit with a barrage of aggressive couriers and threatening litigation paperwork. They had assumed that a young single black woman without a massive corporate law firm behind her would instantly fold under the sheer terrifying weight of their legal letterhead. When their intimidation tactics were met with a brick wall of silence, and when my only response to their mandatory mediation summons was a defiant "see you," the dynamic fundamentally shifted. They were no longer dealing with a frightened desk clerk. They were dealing with an adversary who refused to play by their script. At exactly 3:15 on Tuesday afternoon, my personal cell phone began to ring. It was resting face up on my kitchen table, positioned right beside the black leather presentation portfolio containing my mother's certified irrevocable trust. The screen illuminated, displaying a restricted number. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. The corporate lawyers had failed to force a surrender, which meant the billionaire heir was stepping in to handle the situation personally. I let the phone ring 3 times, allowing the suspense to build on his end, before I calmly swiped the screen and accepted the call. I pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Kendra," the voice said. It was Connor. The smooth, practiced country club baritone that he usually reserved for buttering up local politicians and charming zoning board members was entirely gone. The fake, benevolent neighbor routine had been stripped away, revealing the raw, arrogant entitlement that had fueled his family's wealth for generations. He sounded tense, vibrating with a coiled, venomous frustration. "I am listening," I replied, my voice projecting a flat, emotionless professionalism. "I am going to do you a massive favor right now, Kendra." Connor began adopting the tone of a weary god descending from the heavens to grant a miracle to a peasant. "My father's litigation team wants to absolutely crush you tomorrow morning. They want to drag you into that courthouse, freeze every single one of your personal bank accounts, and make a very public, very painful example out of you for interfering with this development. They want to bankrupt you before the judge even bangs his gavel. But I told them to hold off. I told them to give me 5 minutes to talk to you directly, man to man, so to speak, to see if we can resolve this without completely destroying your life." I reached out and lightly traced the embossed seal on the cover of my leather portfolio. "How generous of you." "You are out of your depth here," Connor said, his voice dripping with heavy condescension. "You are playing a game with rules you do not even begin to understand. This is not some petty rural boundary dispute over a broken fence. This is a $50 million commercial real estate venture backed by elite institutional investors. We have already spent millions on land surveys, municipal permits, and architectural designs. Do you honestly think a clerical error on Valerie's power of attorney is going to stop the bulldozers on Thursday? It is not. Desmond is the legal widower. He possesses established marital rights. We will simply pivot our legal strategy, push the sale through the probate courts, and tie you up in administrative injunctions until you are 50 years old." He paused, clearly waiting for me to stammer, to argue, or to beg. When I offered him nothing but dead air, he let out a harsh, patronizing sigh. "But I do not want to see you ruined over a stubborn grudge." Connor continued, shifting into the role of the pragmatic dealmaker. "You are a smart girl. You have a decent little desk job at that title agency. So I am offering you a clean, painless exit. I am authorized by my father's firm to offer you a one-time, non-negotiable cash buyout, $20,000. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of the number hung in the air. "I will have my personal courier bring you a certified cashier's check within the hour," Connor stated, his tone gaining a sickening triumphant momentum. "You sign the quitclaim deed, you surrender all perceived rights to the farm, you walk away, and you get 20 grand free and clear. Let us be honest, Kendra, that is a massive amount of money for someone in your position. You make, what, 60 grand a year? This pays off whatever student loans you are undoubtedly drowning in. It buys you a nice, reliable car. It gives you a safety net. You do not belong in these high-stakes real estate games. You take the scraps while they are still on the table because by tomorrow morning the offer drops to zero. $20,000. For a sprawling, historic 200-acre estate that had been fiercely protected by my mother's family for 4 generations. For land sitting directly in the epicenter of a billion-dollar commercial expansion zone. He genuinely believed I was a desperate, uneducated girl who would be blinded by a quick cash handout. He looked at my mother's ancestral legacy and saw nothing but a cheap, disposable inconvenience. I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the speakerphone icon, and set the device down on the wooden surface of the table. I opened my laptop, the screen flaring to life, casting a bright blue glow over the kitchen. "I am going to decline your generous offer, Connor," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and highly volatile. When Connor finally spoke again, the mask of the pragmatic businessman shattered completely, replaced by a vicious, snarling cruelty. "You stupid, arrogant little girl," Connor spat, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural register. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable, insignificant life. You think you are safe because you work for Richard Sterling. You think your little title examining license protects you from us." I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the secure encrypted administrative portal for the Georgia State Department of Insurance and Real Estate. "My family has ruined people with 10 times your net worth just for looking at us the wrong way," Connor growled, his voice escalating into a manic, threatening rhythm. "My father bankrupted a rival commercial developer in Savannah last year, just because the guy had the nerve to bid against us on a downtown parking garage. He tied him up in litigation, destroyed his company, took his house, and forced him out of the state just to escape the legal fees. What do you think we are going to do to a desk clerk who tries to hold up a $50 million project?" I typed in my senior compliance officer credentials, bypassing the public interface and entering the restricted regulatory dashboard. "I am not just going to take that farm," Connor snarled, high on his own perceived power, riding the rush of attempting to crush someone he viewed as an insect. "I am going to take your entire livelihood. I already have our legal team drafting a formal complaint to the state board. We are reporting you for professional misconduct, unauthorized access of private financial records, and malicious slander of title. We are going to bury you in so many ethical violations that they will revoke your license permanently." I clicked on the tab labeled Emergency Title Dispute and Injunctions. A complex digital form populated on my screen. I entered the precise parcel identification number for the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. "You will never work in real estate again." Connor continued, his breathing heavy into the microphone. "You will be permanently blacklisted from every agency in the Southeast. You are going to be broke, unemployed, and watching my bulldozers tear down that rotting, worthless farmhouse from the sidewalk. I am going to make sure you lose absolutely everything." He was preaching now, utterly convinced of his own untouchable superiority. I did not interrupt him. I let him vent every ounce of his toxic, entitled rage into the empty air of my kitchen. While his threats poured out of the speaker, my hands were moving with rapid, fluid precision across my keyboard. I dragged and dropped the high-resolution PDF scan of Valerie's fraudulent power of attorney, complete with the damning IP address, trace into the evidentiary attachment window. Then I opened the encrypted file containing the microfiche scans I had pulled from the sub-basement. I attached the state registration, proving the land was a historical, Black-owned trust. Finally, I attached the ultimate weapon, my mother's irrevocable trust, highlighting the specific exclusionary clause that legally severed Desmond from the property and transferred sole ownership directly to me upon my 25th birthday. I checked the final regulatory box formally requesting a lis pendens, a strict, impenetrable legal notice of pending litigation. In the state of Georgia, an active lis pendens acts as a total paralyzing freeze on any property. It immediately halts all construction, prevents any transfer of commercial funds, voids any pending demolition permits, and makes it a state felony for any heavy machinery to alter the physical land until a superior court judge thoroughly reviews the trust. Connor's $50 million development project was about to become a highly radioactive, toxic asset overnight. "You are nothing," Connor sneered, delivering his final triumphant blow. "And by tomorrow morning you will have nothing. I am going to make sure of it." I moved my mouse over the bright blue Submit Official Injunction button at the bottom of the state portal. I clicked it. The screen flashed a green confirmation banner appearing at the top of the monitor, verifying that the legal freeze was active, time-stamped, and officially recorded with the highest regulatory board in the state. No bulldozers, no sale, no commercial transfer. The land was entirely legally locked down. I leaned forward, bringing my face close to the microphone of my phone resting on the table. "Are you done, Connor?" I asked, my voice deadly calm, entirely stripped of any fear or emotion. "Because while you were talking, I just submitted an emergency block to the state board." Connor's voice cut out entirely. The silence on his end was not just shock, it was the abrupt, suffocating realization that he had completely lost control of the narrative. He was a man accustomed to victims who cried, apologized, and begged for leniency. He possessed absolutely no protocol for a target who weaponized state-level regulatory systems while he was mid-sentence. I did not wait for him to find his voice or formulate a response. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the kitchen table. The State Board lis pendens injunction was a powerful opening salvo, but I knew exactly how the commercial real estate machine operated. Billionaires like Connor's father possessed vast political networks. They played golf with state regulators. They donated heavily to judicial campaigns. Given enough time and enough political pressure, they might find a corrupt judge willing to temporarily lift a state block just long enough to push a financial wire transfer through the system. I needed a secondary kill switch, a mechanism that operated entirely outside the realm of easily bribed politicians. I needed the private sector. I opened my email client and began drafting a highly classified, industry-specific notice. In the world of commercial real estate, cash is an illusion. Mega developments are funded by massive syndicated bank loans, and no commercial lender on earth will release $50 million without a pristine, unblemished title insurance policy. The insurance policy is the ultimate safety net for the bank, guaranteeing that the land they are financing is legally clear of any disputes, errors, or fraudulent claims. If the title is deemed uninsurable, the bank instantly freezes the funds. The development dies on the vine. Over my years as a senior compliance officer, I had cultivated direct personal relationships with the regional underwriting directors for the 3 largest national title insurance conglomerates in the country. These were the executives who personally approved policies for skyscrapers, shopping malls, and massive residential subdivisions. They knew my name, they trusted my meticulous work ethic, and they knew I never raised a false alarm. I addressed the email directly to all 3 regional directors. The subject line was clear, absolute, and designed to trigger an immediate panic response. Urgent notice of defective title, fraudulent conveyance, parcel 44-892. I attached the forged power of attorney, the IP address trace leading back to Valerie's retail boutique, and the irrefutable, irrevocable trust establishing my sole ownership. I typed a concise, highly technical summary of the situation, explicitly stating that any title insurance policy issued on the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm would result in an immediate, catastrophic, multi-million-dollar claim payout due to verified felony fraud. I advised them to implement an immediate national blackout on the parcel. I hit send. Within 4 minutes, my inbox chimed with 3 separate red receipts. 2 minutes after that, the replies began to roll in. They were brief, professional, and absolutely devastating to Connor's project. All 3 major national underwriters officially blacklisted the property. They issued internal nationwide bulletins to their local agents explicitly forbidding the issuance of any title policy or closing protection letter associated with Desmond Harrison Connor's development firm or the specific municipal lot. The financial lifeblood of the Oakmont Country Club project was officially severed. Connor could throw as many high-priced corporate lawyers at me as he wanted, but without title insurance, his father's commercial lenders would slam the vault shut. The project was financially paralyzed. But financial paralysis was not enough. I had seen Jada's smug, curated video broadcast to millions of followers. I had seen the yellow bulldozers parked on the southern acreage, their massive steel blades resting aggressively against the soil of my ancestors. Connor and his father were arrogant enough to order a demolition just to spite me attempting to destroy the historic farmhouse before a judge could officially halt the project. They would gladly pay a municipal fine later if it meant erasing my physical leverage today. I needed boots-on-the-ground protection to stop those machines from tearing into my mother's legacy on Thursday morning. I reached back into my black leather presentation portfolio. Beneath the trust documents lay an artifact of immense, staggering historical significance. It was fragile, encased in a protective archival sleeve. It was the original land patent for the farm, dated and stamped shortly after the end of the Civil War. The heavy, faded parchment bore the elegant looping signature of my great-grandfather, a man who had purchased this land with blood, sweat, and unrelenting determination. It was not just a piece of property. It was a monument to survival. It was a registered historical site. I scanned the ancient document using my high-definition home scanner, ensuring every crack, every faded ink mark, and every official state seal was perfectly captured. I navigated to the official portal of the Georgia Historical Preservation Society. This was a notoriously rigid, fiercely protective organization endowed with extraordinary state authority to protect certified heritage sites from commercial destruction. I drafted an emergency petition for intervention. I attached the original land patent, the historical registry numbers, and the corresponding trust documents proving continuous, unbroken familial ownership for over a century. I detailed the immediate imminent threat of illegal demolition orchestrated by Connor's development firm. I formally requested an emergency preservation injunction. I did not submit the form blindly into a generic public inbox. I utilized a private contact number I had acquired during a previous complex commercial title clearance. I dialed the direct cell phone of the Society's Senior Director of Heritage Protection. She answered on the second ring. I explained the situation with clinical precision, stripping away my anger and presenting her with the raw, undeniable facts of the impending destruction of a certified historical Black-owned land trust. I heard the sharp intake of breath on her end of the line. The director was appalled. She assured me, her voice trembling with professional outrage, that she was bypassing standard bureaucratic protocols. She personally initiated a direct binding stop work order. She informed me that she was dispatching armed county sheriff's deputies to the farm property line at dawn. Any contractor, bulldozer operator, or corporate representative who attempted to cross the property line or alter a single blade of grass would be immediately arrested for felony destruction of a state heritage site. I thanked her, ended the call, and closed my laptop. I sat back in my kitchen chair, staring at the dark screen. The silence in my apartment was profound, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of fear. It was the calm, settled quiet of absolute preparation. I had built a fortress. I had severed their funding, blacklisted their title, and surrounded the physical property with armed law enforcement. Connor's lawyers could send 1,000 couriers to my door. Jada could post 100 smug videos mocking my financial status. It did not matter. They were playing a game of intimidation, but I had fundamentally rewritten the rules of engagement. I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and poured the cold remnants of my coffee down the sink. I felt a deep, resonant sense of pride. My mother had known exactly what she was doing when she drafted that trust. She had given me the shield, and I had just forged the sword. I was ready for the courthouse. I was ready to look Connor, his billionaire father, and their army of litigators directly in the eyes and watch their empire crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. I walked into my bedroom to lay out my clothes for the morning, selecting a sharp, tailored navy suit. I wanted to look exactly like the professional executioner I was about to become. As I hung the suit jacket on the closet door, my cell phone rang again from the kitchen table. The sound shattered the serene quiet of the apartment. I assumed it was Connor calling back to hurl another barrage of empty threats now that his commercial lenders were likely panicking over the sudden title insurance blackout. I walked back into the kitchen entirely unbothered and picked up the device. The caller ID did not display a restricted corporate number, it displayed Desmond's name. I stared at the screen for a brief moment. Desmond had been remarkably silent since the confrontation at the country club. He had allowed Valerie to make a fool of herself at my office, and he had hidden behind Connor's aggressive legal team to handle the heavy lifting. His sudden decision to call me directly was a stark deviation from his usual cowardly tactics. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Desmond," I said smoothly. He did not sound angry. He did not sound defensive or panicked or intimidated by the massive legal walls I had just erected around the property. He was laughing. It was a dark, wet, deeply unsettling chuckle that sent an immediate involuntary chill down the center of my spine. It was the sound of a man who held a winning lottery ticket and was watching his opponent push all their chips into the center of the table. "You really thought you were so clever, Kendra?" Desmond said, his voice thick with a sickening triumphant glee. "I have to admit you put up a hell of a fight, blocking the title insurance, calling the Historical Society to send cops to the farm. That was brilliant. Really, it was a masterstroke. Your mother would have been so proud of her little girl." My grip tightened around the edges of the phone. The absolute confidence in his voice defied logic. He should have been terrified. He should have been begging for amnesty. "It is a shame it was completely useless." Desmond continued, the amusement practically dripping through the speaker. "You spent all that time focusing on the state board and the underwriters. You forgot how this county actually works. You forgot who Connor's father plays golf with on Sunday mornings." I remained silent, my heart beginning a slow, heavy, dreadful pounding against my ribs. "Your little title freeze didn't work, Kendra," Desmond stated, savoring every single syllable of the revelation. "Connor's father made one phone call to the chief presiding judge of the Fulton County Superior Court. The judge owes him a massive favor from the last election cycle. He completely bypassed the state board injunction and issued a unilateral emergency override." I shook my head, my mind racing through the legal statutes. "A judge cannot unilaterally override a verified historical trust document," I countered sharply. "It violates federal preservation mandates." Desmond let out another harsh, victorious laugh. "He can when he declares the trust documents under investigation for forgery. The judge just granted us a temporary administrative clearance. He fast-tracked the closing. We are not doing a mediation on Wednesday morning, Kendra. We are executing the final transfer of deed. You lost. Bring a pen to the courthouse." Desmond's laughter rattled through the speaker of my phone, a harsh, grating sound that filled the quiet space of my kitchen. It was the sound of a parasite who mistakenly believed he was the host. "Did you honestly believe your little administrative tricks were going to work?" Desmond asked, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "You filed some paperwork online. You made a few phone calls. That is adorable, Kendra. It really is. But you are playing in a sandbox, and Connor's family owns the entire beach. You do not understand how real power operates. You do not understand what happens when a billionaire picks up the phone and calls a judge whose election campaign he single-handedly funded last November." I remained perfectly still, the glowing screen of my laptop illuminating my face. I did not interrupt him. I let him revel in his borrowed authority. "The judge took one look at your so-called irrevocable trust and laughed." Desmond lied effortlessly. "He declared it a suspected forgery right there on the phone. He signed an emergency injunction overriding your title freeze, and he authorized the immediate, irrevocable transfer of the deed. Connor's father pulled the strings, and I am the one holding the deed. You are entirely out of options. The game is over." Desmond paused, letting the silence stretch, waiting for the sound of my breathing to hitch. He wanted to hear the panic. He wanted to hear the exact moment my spirit broke. "You are exactly the same arrogant, useless girl you were 7 years ago." Desmond sneered, his voice dropping into a vicious, familiar cadence. "You walk around acting like you are so much smarter than everyone else because you have a fancy little office job. But beneath all that cheap confidence, you are nothing. You are a dependent, helpless child. You thought you could disrespect me in my own home, and now you are going to pay the exact same price you paid back then. You are going to lose everything, and you are going to realize that you only survive in this world when men like me allow it." As his vile, degrading words poured through the speaker, the warm, secure walls of my apartment seemed to dissolve. I was no longer standing in a modern kitchen in Atlanta. I was 18 years old again, standing on the crumbling concrete porch of my mother's farmhouse. It was mid-January, the dead of winter, and the wind cutting across the open fields was sharp enough to slice through bone. I could hear the heavy, definitive clack of the brass deadbolt sliding into place, locking me out of the only home I had ever known. I remembered the metallic taste of blood pooling on my tongue, from biting my own lip to stop the tears. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of absolute powerlessness. My mother had just been moved to an inpatient hospice facility, her mind clouded by heavy narcotics, completely unaware of what her husband was doing. The moment she was out of the house, Desmond had packed my clothes into 3 black trash bags, tossed them onto the frozen lawn, and told me I was no longer his financial burden. I remembered walking down the gravel driveway in the dark, dragging those plastic bags behind me. I remembered opening the door of my 2004 Honda Civic. The interior smelled of damp upholstery and stale air. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a sluggish, agonizing groan, but the heater core was broken. It blew nothing but frigid, icy air directly into my face. I remembered wrapping myself in a thin, promotional fleece blanket I had saved from a high school track meet. I curled into a tight ball on the cracked vinyl of the back seat, shivering uncontrollably as the temperature dropped below freezing. I watched the warm yellow light glowing from the living room window of my mother's house. I watched Desmond's silhouette pass by the glass holding a glass of bourbon, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just forced his wife's daughter to sleep in a freezing vehicle. That night in the Honda Civic was the defining crucible of my life. As I lay there, my teeth chattering, feeling the frost form on the inside of the windshield, the panic and the sorrow had slowly frozen into something else. The fear had crystallized into pure, unadulterated rage. I realized in the suffocating cold of that car that the world was entirely indifferent to my suffering. I realized that tears were a useless currency. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted to ensure that no man like Desmond Harrison could ever render me homeless and helpless again, I needed to understand the mechanics of power. I needed to understand the laws that governed the earth beneath my feet. That freezing night was the exact moment I decided to dedicate my life to the meticulous, unforgiving study of property law. Desmond had intended to break me. Instead, he had forged the very weapon that was about to destroy him. The memory faded, snapping back to the present reality of my brightly lit kitchen. Desmond was still talking, still riding the high of his imaginary victory. "So here is exactly what is going to happen tomorrow morning," Desmond commanded, his tone shifting into absolute dictatorial authority. "You are going to pack up your pathetic, wounded pride. You are going to put on a nice, cheap suit. You are going to march into courtroom 4B at 9 o'clock sharp. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will approach the bench, you will take the pen Connor's lawyers hand you, and you will sign the quitclaim deed unconditionally surrendering the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. You will sign away every single right you think you have." I stood perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the black leather presentation portfolio resting on the table. My mind operated with the cold, frictionless precision of a supercomputer. Desmond was a spectacular fool, and Connor's father was a desperate man attempting to play a losing hand. I analyzed the legal reality of their so-called fast-tracked closing. A corrupt county judge possessed the authority to issue a temporary emergency override on a state-level administrative injunction. It was a dirty, underhanded tactic used to force an opposing party into a panic settlement. But that temporary judicial order was practically worthless in the actual machinery of commercial real estate. A county judge in Fulton, Georgia, had absolutely zero jurisdiction over the internal risk assessment protocols of a national title insurance conglomerate. The judge could bang his gavel and demand the closing proceed, but he could not force a private underwriter to issue a clean title policy on a property flagged for active verified felony fraud. Furthermore, a county judge possessed zero authority to override a federal mandate from the Historical Preservation Society. Connor's mega development was entirely funded by institutional banks. Those banks required a spotless title policy and a clear construction site. Right now, Connor had neither. The title was blacklisted nationwide, and armed sheriff's deputies were stationed at the property line to prevent any heavy machinery from moving. Connor's father was not fast-tracking the closing because he had won. He was fast-tracking the closing because he was absolutely terrified. The institutional investors funding the $50 million project were undoubtedly demanding answers regarding the sudden catastrophic title blackout. If Connor's team did not produce a legally binding quitclaim deed featuring my physical signature by tomorrow morning, their entire financial house of cards would collapse. The bank would pull the funding, the development firm would be in catastrophic breach of contract, and the resulting financial fallout would cost Connor's family tens of millions of dollars in penalties. They needed my signature to lift the blackout and save the project. Desmond was simply the attack dog they had sent to ensure I showed up to the courthouse thoroughly intimidated and ready to surrender. They needed me to believe I was beaten so that I would hand them the victory they could not legally achieve on their own. If you do exactly what you are told, Desmond continued, adopting a tone of sickening false mercy, I will personally speak to Connor. I will tell him to reinstate the $20,000 buyout offer. You take the money, you go back to your little apartment, and you consider yourself incredibly lucky that we let you walk away with anything at all. But if you walk into that courtroom tomorrow and try to pull another stunt, the judge will hold you in criminal contempt. Connor's lawyers will file civil damages that will garnish your wages for the rest of your natural life. You will walk out of that courthouse in handcuffs, Kendra. Do you understand me? I reached out and placed my hand firmly over the smooth, cool leather of my portfolio. Inside rested the certified, irrevocable trust, the National Underwriter blackout confirmations, and the Federal Preservation Mandate. I had everything I needed to not only stop the closing, but to subject Connor's lawyers to severe ethical sanctions for attempting to execute a fraudulent property transfer before a presiding judge. Desmond had kicked a terrified 18-year-old girl out into the freezing cold, assuming she would simply disappear. Tomorrow morning, he was going to discover exactly what kind of woman she had become in the dark. I asked if you understand me, Kendra. Desmond barked, his patience wearing thin at my prolonged silence. Bring a pen to the courthouse, sign the paper, end this. I smiled into the phone, my voice completely devoid of fear. I'll be there, Dad, but I'm bringing something much better than a pen. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B felt cold under my palms as I pushed them open on Wednesday morning. The Fulton County Courthouse was a towering monument to institutional power, a place built of polished marble and echoing corridors designed specifically to make the average citizen feel small. The air inside the mediation room was heavily air-conditioned and smelled faintly of floor wax and extremely expensive cologne. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, projecting a calm I had spent the last 12 hours perfecting. They were all waiting for me. On the left side of the room, occupying the plaintiff's table, sat Connor's formidable legal team. There were 3 attorneys in total, all wearing custom-tailored navy suits, their briefcases open, their laptops glowing. At the center of them sat Connor, exuding the relaxed, untouchable confidence of a man who believed he owned the building, the judge, and the very air I was breathing. He was leaning back in his leather chair, whispering something to his lead attorney and sharing a quiet, cruel laugh. Desmond sat at the far end of the table. He was wearing a brand-new, sharply cut gray blazer that he had absolutely purchased on credit, assuming his massive payday was only minutes away. He looked at me as I approached the defendant's table, his eyes shining with a toxic, predatory triumph. He offered me a slow, mocking smile, silently reminding me of his promise from the night before. He genuinely believed I was walking to the gallows. Directly behind them, seated in the first row of the polished wooden gallery benches, were Jada and Valerie. Jada was aggressively chewing a piece of gum, holding her smartphone up to capture the lighting in the room, clearly preparing to record her victorious post-court social media update. Beside her, Valerie was not even pretending to pay attention to the legal proceedings. She had a large silver iPad propped up on her lap. Even from 10 feet away, I could see exactly what she was doing. She was actively browsing a luxury car dealership inventory. I watched her perfectly manicured finger swipe across the screen, zooming in on the caramel leather interior of a brand new Porsche Cayenne. She was already spending the money they believed they were stealing from me. She was already picking out the upholstery. I took my seat at the empty defendant's table. I placed my black leather presentation portfolio squarely in front of me. I did not open it. I simply folded my hands and waited. A door behind the judicial bench opened, and Magistrate Caldwell strode into the room. He was a stern, severely imposing man, with a reputation for clearing dockets quickly and brutally. He did not tolerate wasted time, and he clearly resented being pulled into an emergency mediation session on a Wednesday morning. He dropped a thick file folder onto his desk, adjusted his reading glasses, and glared down at the room. "Let us get this over with," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice booming through the quiet courtroom. "We are here on an emergency fast-tracked docket regarding a title dispute and pending transfer of deed for parcel 44-892, known as the Cecilia Harrison property. This court granted a temporary administrative override of a state board injunction late yesterday evening due to the exceptional financial damages accumulating against Oakmont Country Club, LLC. I understand the plaintiff's counsel has prepared a quitclaim deed to resolve this matter instantly." Connor's lead attorney stood up immediately, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked over at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney said smoothly. "We are simply here to correct a highly unfortunate clerical dispute. My client's Oakmont Country Club and the rightful legal widower, Mr. Desmond Harrison, have been incredibly patient. We understand that the defendant, Ms. Harrison, is acting out of a place of emotional distress regarding her late mother's estate. However, her actions have caused a catastrophic delay in a $50 million municipal development. We have offered her a highly generous severance package to walk away cleanly today. We have the quitclaim deed prepared, Your Honor. Once she signs, we will withdraw our threats of civil damages and the court can lift the block on the title." The attorney picked up a heavy, gold-plated Mont Blanc pen from his table. He walked the few steps over to my table and slid the pen across the polished mahogany surface. It rolled smoothly, coming to a stop directly against the edge of my black portfolio. He leaned down, placing both hands on my table, lowering his voice so only I and the judge could hear him clearly. "Sign the paper, Kendra," the attorney ordered, his tone shifting from fake pity to a razor-sharp threat. "If you refuse, I will personally ask Judge Caldwell to hold you in criminal contempt of court for filing a fraudulent state injunction. I will freeze your bank accounts by noon. You will leave this building in handcuffs, and you will owe my firm legal fees for the rest of your life. Pick up the pen." Connor leaned forward in his chair, a smug, expectant grin plastered across his face. Desmond crossed his arms, nodding approvingly at the lawyer's aggression. In the gallery, Valerie finally looked up from her iPad, eager to witness my humiliation. Judge Caldwell peered over his glasses. "Ms. Harrison, are you prepared to execute the quitclaim deed and surrender your claim to the property so we can finalize this transfer?" I did not touch the pen. I did not look at the attorney hovering over my table. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the judge. The fear they had tried to instill in me over the past 48 hours did not exist. It had been entirely burned away, replaced by the cold, flawless mechanics of the law. I reached out and unlatched the brass clasps of my portfolio. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the tense silence of the courtroom. I opened the cover and pulled out the thick stack of certified watermarked documents I had printed from the county sub-basement. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice projecting with absolute unwavering authority. I cannot sign over property that these people do not own. The courtroom froze. The smug grin on Connor's face instantly vanished. The lead attorney scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes as he stood up straight. "Your Honor, we are not doing this," the attorney objected aggressively. "The defendant is attempting to stall the proceedings. Desmond Harrison submitted a fully notarized registered warranty deed transferring ownership of the farm to his name shortly after his wife's passing. He is the sole owner. This is a matter of public record." "It is a matter of public forgery," I corrected sharply, standing up from my chair. I picked up the first stack of documents and walked purposefully toward the judge's bench. I handed the heavy pages to the bailiff, who passed them up to Magistrate Caldwell. "What you are looking at, Your Honor, are the original microfiche prints pulled directly from the county archives last night," I explained, turning to face Connor's legal team. "The deed Desmond Harrison provided to this court and to Oakmont Country Club is a complete fabrication. If you look at the filing date printed on Desmond's document, it claims to have been executed and logged into the county system on October 12th. However, the official microfiche index for that exact volume and page number, which you now hold in your hands, contains a municipal water right transfer for a property in Alpharetta. Desmond's deed does not exist in the physical county records. It was digitally manufactured and slipped into the modern electronic database through a compromised portal." The lead attorney's face lost a fraction of its color. He looked down at Desmond, who was suddenly gripping the edge of his table very tightly. "This is an outrageous accusation," the attorney stammered, scrambling to recover his footing. "Your Honor, our client provided a legally binding document featuring a certified state notary stamp. It was notarized in full compliance with Georgia real estate law. The defendant is making wild, slanderous claims without context." "I am so glad you brought up the notary stamp," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. I walked back to my table and pulled out the next document. I turned my attention away from the lawyers and looked directly at Valerie, who was sitting in the gallery. She was no longer looking at her iPad. She was staring at me, her eyes wide, her posture suddenly rigid. "Let us talk about that specific notary stamp," I said, holding the paper up so the entire room could see it. "The stamp on Desmond's fake deed belongs to a woman named Brenda Collins, a registered notary public in Fulton County, or at least she used to be." I walked the document up to the bailiff. "Your Honor, the document I just provided is a certified disciplinary record directly from the Georgia Secretary of State. Brenda Collins is Valerie's biological sister. And as you will see on page 2 of that state record, Brenda Collins had her notary license permanently revoked and was barred from practicing in this state exactly 5 years prior to the date stamped on Desmond's deed. She lost her license for participating in mortgage fraud." A heavy, suffocating silence slammed down onto the courtroom. In the gallery, Valerie let out a sharp, audible gasp. The color entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Her hands began to shake, and the heavy silver iPad she had been using to shop for luxury cars slipped off her lap. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent, echoing crash, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of cracked glass. Jada shrank back into her seat, instantly realizing she had broadcasted a massive corporate crime to 2 million followers. Connor's lead attorney looked as if he had just been physically struck. He stared at the documents in front of the judge, his mouth slightly open. In the legal world, submitting a forged document to a superior court judge is a career-ending event. He realized in real time that his firm had failed to conduct basic due diligence. They had trusted a greedy widower and a compromised title agent, and now they were standing in open court actively participating in a felony. "Your Honor," the attorney stuttered, stepping away from Desmond as if the man were suddenly highly radioactive. "My firm had no knowledge. We were provided these documents by the client in good faith." Desmond realized his entire scheme was collapsing. The forgery had been dragged into the light, meticulously dissected, and completely destroyed. The money, the power, the new life he had envisioned was evaporating right in front of his eyes. Panic overrode his logic. He abandoned the fake deed entirely, pivoting back to the exact same arrogant entitlement that had fueled him for 7 years. He jumped up from his chair, violently slamming both of his fists down onto the mahogany table. "It does not matter," Desmond roared, his voice echoing frantically off the marble walls. "It does not matter if the stamp is old. I was her husband. I lived in that house. I paid taxes on that land. Under state law, I am the legal widower. I am entitled to standard spousal inheritance. That property belongs to me by marriage, and I have the absolute legal right to sell it to Connor's firm right now." I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unmoved by his outburst. I looked at the man who had thrown me out into the freezing cold, the man who had called me a helpless, worthless child. He was unraveling, grasping at invisible straws, relying on a basic, outdated understanding of probate law. I reached into my portfolio one final time and pulled out the thick, watermarked, irrevocable trust. I shook my head slowly, feeling the immense protective weight of my mother's brilliance guiding my hand. "Not when there is an irrevocable trust," I said softly, the words ringing out with absolute, undeniable finality. The heavy, oppressive silence in the courtroom was absolute as I slid the certified irrevocable trust across the polished mahogany table. Judge Caldwell picked up the document, adjusting his reading glasses as his eyes scanned the thick, raised watermarks of the state archivist. The smugness had completely drained from Desmond's face, replaced by a pale, sickening realization that the ground beneath his feet was rapidly giving way. Connor's lead attorney did not even try to look at the document. He was already leaning away from his clients, creating a physical distance that signaled the impending collapse of their entire legal strategy. "You want to claim standard spousal inheritance, Desmond," I stated, my voice ringing clear and authoritative across the silent room. "You want to rely on generic probate laws to steal a property you never contributed a single dime toward." But my mother was a fiercely intelligent woman. She knew exactly what kind of parasite she had married. She knew you were funneling money out of her business accounts, and more importantly, she knew exactly where that money was going. I turned my gaze toward Valerie, who was still frozen in the gallery, her shattered iPad resting on the floor at her feet. 2 years before she died, my mother hired a private investigator. I continued making sure every single person in the room heard the absolute truth. She knew about the affair, Desmond. She knew you were sleeping with Valerie. She possessed the photographs, the hotel receipts, and the bank statements proving you were using her hard-earned money to finance your infidelity. Instead of filing for a messy public divorce while battling a terminal illness, she quietly hired a specialized estate attorney. She executed this irrevocable trust. Judge Caldwell turned to the final page of the document, his expression grim and resolute. "I will read this into the record," Judge Caldwell announced, his booming voice cutting through the tension. "Section 4, Paragraph B. The grantor, Cecilia Harrison, hereby explicitly and permanently severs any and all marital property rights, spousal claims, and executor privileges previously held by her husband, Desmond Harrison. This severance is executed due to documented financial abuse and marital infidelity. Total undisputed ownership of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm is hereby placed into a blind trust to be transferred entirely and exclusively to the grantor's biological daughter, Kendra Harrison, upon her 25th birthday." The judge lowered the document and glared directly at Desmond. "This trust was filed, sealed, and executed 2 years prior to her passing. You possessed absolutely zero legal right to this land. You were entirely stripped of your marital claims. You have presented this court with a fraudulently manufactured deed to sell a property you did not own." Desmond staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his chair. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for gravity to take hold. Suddenly, the quiet of the courtroom was shattered by a violent, explosive shout. "You stupid, incompetent fraud!" Connor leaped to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the hardwood floor. His face was flushed crimson with absolute, unadulterated rage. He was not looking at me. He was glaring at Desmond with a level of hatred that was almost terrifying to witness. The polished, arrogant billionaire heir had completely lost his mind. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Connor screamed, completely ignoring the judge's sharp demand for order. "You sat in my father's office and swore you held the master deed. You swore this was a clean transaction. We completely bypassed the standard escrow protocols because of your assurances. My firm already wired a $2 million non-refundable deposit directly into your offshore holding account in the Caymans. We sent that money yesterday afternoon to secure the demolition permits. Connor slammed his hands down on the table, pointing a shaking finger at Desmond's face. I want that money returned to my father's corporate account right now. If you do not wire those funds back by the end of the hour, I will personally see to it that you are buried under the prison. I watched Connor's meltdown with a cold, calculating satisfaction. He had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle. He had just confessed to the exact financial transaction I needed to execute the ultimate strike. I reached into my portfolio one last time. I pulled out a single sheet of paper distinctly different from the county archives. It carried the bold, unmistakable emblem of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I did not hand this document to the judge. I slid it directly across the plaintiff's table until it rested right in front of Connor's shaking hands. You are not getting that $2 million back, Connor, I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting. And a missing deposit is the least of your concerns right now. Connor stared down at the federal document, his breathing ragged. What is this? He demanded, though the fear in his eyes indicated he already knew. You did not just buy a farm, Connor, I explained, leaning forward, ensuring my words dismantled the final pillars of his arrogance. You bought a federal wire fraud charge. Your development firm utilized a forged state document created by a disgraced unlicensed notary to authorize the transfer of $2 million. You then transmitted those funds across international lines into an offshore account. Furthermore, the land you were attempting to illegally purchase and demolish is officially registered as a protected Black historical land trust. I tapped my finger sharply against the FBI document. When you combine interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, and the attempted destruction of a federally protected heritage site, you are no longer dealing with a civil property dispute. You trigger the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. I submitted this entire portfolio to the Federal Financial Crimes Division at 6 o'clock this morning. By attempting to fast-track this illegal closing, your entire company, your father's board of directors, and your executive team are now under active federal investigation. Connor's mouth fell open. He looked at his lead attorney, desperate for a legal shield, a loophole, any shred of protection. The attorney simply shook his head, taking another slow step away from the table. He was already mentally drafting his resignation letter. This court is immediately halting all civil mediation proceedings, Judge Caldwell announced. The magistrate's voice was like thunder. He was thoroughly disgusted by the sheer scale of the deception that had been attempted in his courtroom. This is no longer a matter of property transfer. This is a verified multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy. Judge Caldwell did not wait for an objection. He reached across his desk, picked up his heavy black desk phone, and pressed a single button. Bailiffs, the judge commanded into the receiver. Secure the courtroom. Lock the doors. Nobody leaves. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung shut with a loud, definitive crash. Two armed county sheriff's deputies stepped in front of the exit, resting their hands firmly on their duty belts. Desmond snapped his head around, staring at the locked doors and the armed guards. The arrogant sneer he had worn just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Beside him, Valerie let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail. They realized in a single crushing instant that they were not leaving this courthouse as millionaires. They were leaving in handcuffs. Complete and total chaos erupted inside the mediation room. Connor backed away from the table, his hands raised as if he could physically push the federal implications away from his pristine reputation. He turned frantically, his panicked eyes landing on Jada, who was still sitting in the gallery, clutching her designer handbag like a life preserver. The polished influencer facade had melted away, leaving her looking small and terrified. The realization that his family's billion-dollar empire was now facing federal indictments because of his association with Desmond and Valerie completely shattered Connor's loyalty. He needed a scapegoat, and he found one instantly. You brought these people to me, Connor screamed at Jada, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. You told me your father was a legitimate businessman. You told me this land was a clean acquisition. Your entire family is nothing but a pack of cheap, desperate con artists. Jada shrank back against the wooden bench, tears spilling over her perfectly contoured cheeks. Connor, please, she begged, her voice trembling. I did not know. I swear I did not know about the forgery. Do not speak to me, Connor roared, completely disregarding the judge's demands for order. He ripped the expensive platinum engagement ring off his finger and threw it onto the hardwood floor. We are done. The engagement is over. The wedding is canceled. If you or your criminal family ever try to contact me or my father's company again, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable lives behind bars. Jada fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. Her entire curated wealthy future had just been violently ripped away on public record. At the defendant's table, Valerie realized the walls were closing in. She looked at the bailiffs advancing down the center aisle, their handcuffs already unholstered. Self-preservation completely overrode whatever affection she held for Desmond. It was his idea, Valerie shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at Desmond's chest. I did not want to do it. He forced me to stamp the deed. He stole my sister's old notary equipment from the garage. He told me if I did not sign the paperwork, he would leave me. I am a victim here. He manipulated me. Desmond stared at her, utterly betrayed by the woman he had destroyed his marriage for. You lying parasite! Desmond spat, his voice cracking with panic. You were the one who researched the state database. You were the one who set up the offshore accounts. You wanted the $2 million just as badly as I did. Silence! Judge Caldwell's voice boomed over the screaming match. He pointed directly at the two of them. Bailiffs, take Mr. Harrison and Miss Collins into custody. Detain them in the holding cells downstairs until federal authorities arrive to take jurisdiction of the wire fraud charges. The two armed deputies moved swiftly. They grabbed Desmond by the shoulders, wrenching his arms behind his back. The sharp, heavy click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. A second deputy secured Valerie, who was screaming hysterically, her luxury heels scraping against the floor as she tried to pull away. As the deputies forcefully marched them toward the side exit, Desmond dug his heels into the floor. He twisted his body, looking back over his shoulder. His eyes locked onto mine. The arrogance, the bullying, the supreme entitlement were entirely gone. He was nothing but a pathetic, desperate man, facing the complete destruction of his life. Kendra, please! Desmond begged, his voice high and entirely broken. Tell them to stop. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I am your father. You cannot let them do this to me. You cannot let me die in a federal prison. I stood calmly at my table, meticulously sliding my mother's trust documents back into my black leather portfolio. I secured the brass clasps, feeling the satisfying weight of the case in my hands. I looked down at him, my expression completely devoid of sympathy. Like you told me when I was 18, Desmond, I said, my voice cold and unyielding. If you cannot handle it, get out. I turned my back on him. I walked down the center aisle of the courthouse, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic cadence against the marble floor. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bright morning light, leaving the frantic screams and the shattered remains of their lives entirely behind me. 10 years later, the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the sprawling green pastures of the Cecilia Harrison Heritage Farm. I stood on the wraparound porch of the main farmhouse, breathing in the crisp, clean Georgia air. The property was no longer an empty, contested plot of land fighting against the threat of corporate bulldozers. It was a thriving, vibrant sanctuary. I was 35 years old, and the farm had been completely transformed. The southern acreage where Connor had once parked his demolition equipment was now a massive, debt-free agricultural community center. State-of-the-art greenhouses and vertical farming structures operated year-round, serving as an incubator program for young, brilliant Black agricultural entrepreneurs. The old barns had been fully restored into modern high-tech classrooms where students learned sustainable farming and commercial supply chain management. I ran the entire operation. It was a multi-million-dollar nonprofit trust entirely shielded by federal preservation laws and highly profitable through our organic supply contracts with major Atlanta restaurant groups. We had taken the land my mother fought to protect and turned it into an untouchable fortress of generational wealth and education. My cell phone buzzed in the pocket of my denim jacket. I pulled it out and answered the call. It was my lead corporate attorney checking in for our weekly briefing. "Good morning, Kendra," my attorney said cheerfully. "I just wanted to give you the final update on the quarterly compliance reports. Everything is perfectly in the green. Also, I received the mandatory state notification regarding the restitution payments from the fraud case." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, leaning against the wooden railing of the porch. "Go ahead." Desmond's latest appeal for early release was officially denied by the Federal Parole Board. My attorney stated, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "He is currently serving the remaining 4 years of his 7-year sentence for interstate wire fraud at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. He has been assigned to the prison laundry detail." I watched a group of young students walk across the lawn toward the greenhouses, laughing and carrying their soil testing kits, and Valerie avoided federal prison by taking a plea deal and testifying against him, the attorney explained. However, she was hit with catastrophic civil penalties and complete asset forfeiture to return Connor's deposit. She currently works the night shift at a 24-hour commercial laundromat in Alpharetta. Every single paycheck she earns is aggressively garnished by the state to pay off her court restitutions. She will be paying off that debt for the rest of her natural life. I nodded slowly, feeling the warm sun on my face. The universe had a remarkable way of balancing the scales. They had tried to steal my home and build a life of luxury on a foundation of lies. Now they were spending their days washing other people's dirty clothes, completely erased from the legacy they had tried to destroy. "Thank you for the update," I said. "I will review the quarterly reports this afternoon. Have a good weekend." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I took one last look out over the beautiful, thriving land that belonged entirely to me, and entirely to the future. I smiled at the morning sun, turned around, and walked inside my beautiful home. The heavy wooden door closed softly behind me, locking out the past forever. The most profound lesson from this journey is that true power is never found in loud threats or arrogant displays of wealth. It is forged in the quiet, meticulous moments of preparation. When you are underestimated and discarded by toxic individuals, your greatest defense is unwavering self-reliance. Never allow anyone's cruel narrative to dictate your worth or steal your legacy. By establishing ironclad boundaries and trusting in your own undeniable competence, the sheer arrogance of your abusers will inevitably become the instrument of their own downfall. True justice is the peace you build for yourself. Have you ever had to silently rebuild your life and prove toxic people wrong? Share your own triumphant comeback story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering tales of justice.